As many of you know, I am an inveterate reader. I average probably a book every week or two. I'm also a movie nut. Not so much lately, but it all goes back to when I was a kid growing up in Atlanta and the Saturday afternoon movie for all the kids. A double feature, a serial, a cartoon, 10 cents to get in, 40 cents will buy you, trying to remember, it will buy you a Coke, popcorn, and Milk Duds. Milk Duds. 50 cents. And my parents got rid of me all Saturday afternoon. As my Jewish son-in-law would say, what a plan, what a plan, what a deal. But I am also not only a reader, but that movie nut. Where I live now, every Wednesday night is movie night. Usually first run movies. $1 will get you in and all the popcorn you can spill on the floor. So what I want to do today is something a little bit different. We've heard the lessons read. 3 different people, 3 different men, at 3 different times in history. I'm told that in the movie business there's a method called a cutaway, where a character will appear on the screen and then there will be sort of like a flashback that explains who this person is and why they are the way they are. So this morning we have heard 3 men speak. 3 men who appear on the pages of history. 3 men who are prominent in our scriptures, both in the Christian and in the Hebrew scriptures. So what I would like for you to do is use your imagination, because these 3 men are going to speak individually. They will step out of the shadows into the spotlight and they will tell you their story. And I am here simply to help that story be told. The first one who steps into our view is a young man in his early 20s. He is handsome, well-dressed, and when he speaks it becomes very clear that he is very well educated. He would stand here and tell you his story. It was the year that King Uzziah died. We knew that he was ill, rumored to have leprosy, but he continued to rule. His son Jotham was my best friend. On that day when the bells tolled announcing the king's death, I didn't know what to do. The world as I had known it had come to an end. Jotham, my friend, would ascend to the throne in his father's place, and that would make everything different. It would make our relationship different. The Assyrian armies were nearby, threatening all of Judah, and everyone knew that it was only a matter of time before there would be a war. I didn't know what to do, so I walked the streets, and everywhere there was weeping and people were afraid. I found myself on the steps of the temple. I climbed those steps and went through the courtyards and into the sacred place, the sanctuary. The smoke billowed from the high altar. And all around the sanctuary there were columns of marble, and at the apex of each column there were statues of angels and seraphims. The choirs were singing the psalms, and the incense filled the room. And then it was those marble statues came to life. They became real. And hovering overhead, the heavens opened, and I was in the presence of God. I was undone and I wept, and all of my sins were paraded before me, and I cried out that I was unclean. And then an angel flew to the high altar with tongs and picked a burning coal and touched it to my lips. And I was cleansed. And God cried out for God's people and their lost leader and said, "Whom will I send to my people? Who will go for me?" And I cried out, "Here I am. Send me." He steps back into the shadows, this Isaiah man. And another one takes his place. He's older man, older than Isaiah. His beard has begun to turn gray. He's tall and muscular, and there are scars on his face and his hands. He's sitting in a boat, mending his nets. He has this very deep and resonant voice. He recalls that day clearly. He will tell you that it was a day in late spring and it was hot. The shoreline was filled with people, and children were running around, and many of those people were sick and crippled. They were poor. The children were unattended. And every now and then from the crowd you would hear someone cry, "Rabbi, Rabbi!" They all wanted something from him. A word of hope, a touch that brought healing, and some tried to touch him, as though by touching his very garment they would receive what they wanted and what they needed. He had to have some room to breathe, so he climbed into the bow of my boat and he sat, and they told him about the kingdom. Told him all about the kingdom. The kingdom was where they would be made well. The kingdom was where they would be important. The kingdom was where they would be fed. Food for the body and food for the soul. And then he spoke to me and he said, "Row out into the lake." I did that. And then he said, "Throw out your net." We had all fished all the previous night and had caught nothing. And it was the middle of the day, and the fish don't bite in the middle of the day. And I said under my breath, "You must be crazy. I've been fishing this lake all my life, and I know about fishing if nothing else, and you need to stick to preaching." He didn't say anything except just give it a try. I threw the net out. As I was pulling it in, it got heavier and heavier. I had to call help from my partners, the Zebedee boys. As we hauled the net in, it hit me. Who was this guy? What strange power did he have? And then all of a sudden I saw my whole life before me, all the days weeping, and I turned to this strange man and I said, "Get away from me. Leave me alone." And then he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Don't be afraid. Soon you'll be fishing for people." Simon steps back into the shadows, and his place is taken by a short, balding, and bearded man who is older, walks with a limp, has scars on his face as though he had been beaten. But he speaks well. He's obviously learned, educated, and he's used to speaking to audiences. He will tell you, "My name is Samuel." Really, it's Saul. At least that was my birth name. I was born in Tarsus, a trade and commerce city in Turkey, a port city to the eastern trade routes. My family was merchants, and they were fairly wealthy. I learned the trade of awning and tent making, but my first love was the Scriptures. I was raised a Pharisee and became one for my whole life. I studied with the best scholars locally, and then my parents sent me to Jerusalem to study with the renowned Gamaliel, the greatest rabbi of his day. I spent 3 years with him. And when he had taught me all he knew, I asked his blessing so that I could go ferret out those who were teaching this new and radical religion. This thing they called the Way. Called themselves people of the Way. And they worshiped this one Jesus, a crucified criminal. I was on my way to Damascus when it happened. Luke writes about it in that book of his, the Acts of the Apostles. There was the blinding light and the voice that called me by name, the one who identified himself as Jesus. I was knocked to the ground, and it was as though all of my faults and secrets and past failures paraded before me. I was terrified. Then I felt warm, and as though I was once again a child, and my mother was holding me. Later, I realized that all my life I had been striving to be holy, and I always fell short. And I felt dirty. But this one called Jesus made me feel clean. So what you see is what you get. By the grace of God, I am what I am. 3 different men, 3 different times and places, and yet the stories have a common thread that runs through them. The common thread of being an ordinary person whom God chooses to use to do extraordinary things. See, these were everyday people like you and me. They each had their own little foibles. They each carried some baggage. Sometimes they were elated, and other times they were depressed. Not one of them is noted for their great faith or their deep spirituality, at least not at the beginning of their careers. They were hard-headed and set in their ways, and yet they were called and they were used. The second thread that links them to one another is a lesson we need to hear and pay attention to. And that is, when you are called or led or pushed to go where you do not want to go and do what you do not want to do, pay attention. Pay attention. It may well be that God is calling you. None of these 3 men I have just tried to tell their story wanted to go or do what God had in mind. They all found reason why they were not the right person. In the end, the message to them is always, and it is to us, my strength is sufficient for you. It's possible that someone among you is being called right now to go and do what they would rather avoid. That person is probably scared and reluctant. So hear the promise that was given to those 3 men. My strength is sufficient for you. And the last thread that runs through these is a line from the Epistle to the Hebrews, which reads, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Those 3 men, Isaiah, Peter, and Paul, fell into the hands of God. And God turned their lives upside down. God made Isaiah a prophet with a message people didn't want to hear. Peter became a fisher of men and was crucified upside down. And Paul became the evangelist to the Gentile world, despised by his own people. God shaped them and formed them and made them new. See, when you fall into the hands of the living God, He will not let you go. He will not let you go. So, God will love you with a love you have never known before. And that's a promise. Amen.